righty. Now, let us get on with things. All right, just posting up the URLs. Don't go away. I will be with you in a momento. And that is not the same as a memento. Important distinction for those of us who are finicky about language. Not that I am. Not that I'm one of those horrible people. I just hate it when people get the language wrong. All right. Okay, and so here we are. Good morning, Luddites and jumble sales. I'm here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever part of the world you're in. My name's Tad Williams. I'm going to be reading, and who knows what else, what other exciting thing I might suddenly decide to do, because, you know, I'm just that kind of wild and crazy character. Now I'm going to read. So who's out there? Ilva, good morning, darling. Chris, hello, good to see you too. Ronnie, good morning. Mihai, I hope I'm pronouncing the name right, and if not, please correct me, and it's a cool name. Looks, Romanian, I'm not sure. Anyway, but nice to see you. Welcome aboard. Petra, hello Petra, hello Svan. Hello, Rosalba. Hello, Wouter. Petra again. And Olaf. My good buddy Olaf. And Carol. And Alex. Hello, Alex. And hello, Dirk. All right, I'm glad a few people are there. Are here, are wherever we are in this virtual space that we are all inhabiting together by the mere fact of your attention while I am blathering. Think about that. It's rather interesting, isn't it? We are no longer bound by geography. The day may come when we are not even bound by physical bodies, but at the moment we are merely not bound by geography, and we can make spaces. These are in fact virtual spaces that we are inhabiting, which is pretty interesting. And it's pretty science fiction for an old bugger like me. Josh, my nephew Josh, my very fine and wonderful nephew Josh, has checked in also, which is always lovely to see. And hey, by the way, Josh, congrats on getting Aston Villa back up into the Premier League and playing pretty damn well, especially compared to Arsenal, which is the closest thing I have to, since we lived, you know, in Highbury. Which is the closest thing to a Premier League fandom that I have, although obviously I have sympathy for Villa also because much of my English family supports it. Anyway, and Christine, hello Christine as well. Anyway, good to have you aboard, Josh, however briefly, however long you're stopping by for. So, what are we going to talk about? As I mentioned, this is a politics and bitching and ranting free zone. I've been doing a lot of bitching and ranting lately on my various social media pages about various political things, but we're not going to talk about them here. I am going to have a Mr. Rogers moment here and take off my sweatshirt or jacket or hoodie or whatever the heck you want to call it. For those who are curious what I'm wearing tonight, you'll have to wait for the OnlyFans. No, I'm wearing... There you go, my Bob Ross t-shirt. Let's make them birds. Yeah, they're birds now. Oh, thank you, Christine. Yeah, it kind of snuck up on me too. Um, uh, and Ronnie, yes, I should. I should. I should write a book about everything. I can only write the books I have time. I have so many more books in me than I have time to write, which is true, I think, for probably most writers, which is what makes it particularly poignant, funny, but sad when someone comes up to me or another writer, because I know I've heard this from other writers as well. When people come up to me at parties or something, and they've heard that I'm a writer, and they're always like, "Yeah, I've got this idea. Like, I just don't have time to write books. But I'll share it with you. You write it, and we'll split the money." And of course, I mean, for one thing, obviously, if it's a good idea, then do something with it. But ideas are never the problem for the writers that I know. Anyway, I can't speak for all writers, but ideas are not the problem. Time, energy, getting the writing done, getting the work done, churning out the pages, telling the story. Haha, Mihai, thank you for confirming that. Hello, back to Romania. I've never been there, but I have been to a few Eastern European countries and would like to come to more. So one of these days, I hope to make it to Romania, and just like I would like to make it to Bulgaria and some other places in that part of the world. I have seen Croatia and Czech Republic and a little tiny bit of Hungary and Poland, but there are many other places that I would like to see too. So anyway, thank you for joining me. So that's basically where it is. I always have more ideas than I have time to write. And not that any of you people have offered to kindly split with me if I do the writing part and you come up with the idea. But it's really funny also. I mean, I've always thought there's a kind of a thing there, and that everybody who went through some kind of school system knows how to write. And many of them wrote stories or something in school. And so their feeling is like, well, you just do it longer or more often or something like that. And that's what writers do. Of course, for any serious writer, and I don't mean serious in the sense of, academic or whatever. I just mean anybody who takes their writing really seriously, and especially if they're also writing to make a living. We definitely have that kind of thing where we've had to learn what we're doing. But it always amused me because, and I think I've said this before, it's like, I can't imagine somebody walking up to somebody at a party, and finding out they're a doctor and pinning them against the wall, metaphorically speaking, and then spending 20, 25 minutes talking about the brain surgery that they do if they only had the time to be a brain surgeon. But everybody seems to think that, writing a book is simple, and, so they're always suggesting this, like, oh, if I only had time, I'd love to be a writer. Like, yeah, if I only had time, I'd love to be a billionaire. But what the heck? I'm too busy, working for a living to just become a billionaire. It takes a lot of I don't know what they think, but anyway, it has always amused me. I certainly would not go up to a firefighter and go, I think I'd try some different things putting out fire. Like, I think I'd have a lot of people really blow hard, like kind of a citizens action thing. Everybody come and go and like to help blow the. No. Anyway, I'm bibbly babbling. Which is different than regular babbling. Okay, so we're going to read War of the Flowers. Oh, that looks like something I'll have to check out, Wouter. Thank you. I will look at that later on. So here's where we are. We are reading War of the Flowers, of course. Theo, the main character, was or is human, has been all his life as far as he knows, but he has gone through the magic doorway, so to speak, and has wound up in fairyland, which is very much like the real world in some ways. But of course, it is fairyland, so there's all kinds of fairy creatures, and it runs on, quote, magic, which is their version of science. And they're actually having a major crisis over failures of their power systems. But anyway, so Theo and his companions, who are now two, Applecore, a very small sprite with a wicked sense of humor and a bit of a temper, and Cumber Sedge, who is a fairisher, which is another kind of fairy, but who met Theo when Theo was being tested by some other fairies because he's from the mortal world. Anyway, Theo and his friends were all lodged in Daffodil House, because all the fairy families are named after flowers, all the big fairy clans. And there was a meeting between the good fairies, who were okay with Theo and mortals in general, and the bad fairies, namely the Thornapple and Foxglove, and worst of all, Hellebore. And during the course of that meeting, which was supposed to be a sort of a treaty or a peace treaty or a negotiation, in fact, the Hellebore faction, the bad guys, never showed up. Why do I always feel like Mike Myers when I do that? They didn't show up, but they did send a rather large dragon to burn Daffodil House down, or at least the part of it in which this meeting was happening, killing everybody, and horrendous thing. And Theo made his way down through the building, and in the process of looking for Apple Core in case she was in the sprite dwelling, found Cumber Sedge, and together they've been trying to escape and have just made it out to the surface again. And so there's Theo. He's got no friends in the world except for Cumber and Apple Core, whom they can't find. And he's being chased by a bodiless something that keeps inhabiting things to follow him, trying to get him on behalf of these bad fairies. And then we also just read a recent part about Streety Nettle, who's another fairy, a country sort of a fairy who has had some kind of weird thing happen to him. And he's being either used or manipulated or something, we're not quite sure what, by some people we don't know yet, except that after the attack on Daffodil House, when he was on his way back to somewhere, we don't know where exactly, after having done something for some unnamed folk who he thinks of as his friends, he took refuge in a goblin house. And that's all we know about him. So anyway, all of that said, I think I whipped through that pretty quick after babbling about a lot of other stuff. Chapter 26, Losing a Friend. And I'm going to try my best to get all the way through this chapter tonight, depending on how long it is. So we will see what we will see. Losing a Friend, War of the Flowers. The air outside was almost as smoky as what had been choking him inside the buildings. But when Theo could stop coughing for a moment, it seemed almost deliciously pure, the breath of angels. He unknotted the sooty shirt around his face and threw it to the ground, then stood, sucking in the wonderful stuff. He resolved to celebrate every single breath he ever took for the rest of his life. Rivulets of golden worker beetles scuttled over the walls that still stood and across the ground, crackling under his feet as he trudged away from the conference center doors. Giant emergency lanterns had been set up all through the grounds of the Daffodil House gardens, out of reach of most of the falling debris, their lamps roofed over with lenses that beamed their mustard-colored light upward through the dark, swirling pall. Shouting constables and singed and dust-smeared victims were everywhere, as purposeless as the golden bugs, except for one group of about a dozen fairies in long gray robes who stood in a circle at the farthest edge of the open space around the building, waving their arms in the air and singing. Some kind of religious group, he assumed, the fairy equivalent of the Salvation Army, praying at a disaster scene. But then he heard a rumble of true thunder from high overhead and felt a spattering of rain on his face. And just at that moment, the singing jumped up a key. Not holy rollers, then, but a fairy version of the volunteer fire department, perhaps. Their true mission, meteorological rather than missionary. Theo shook his head. Time after time, Fairy had almost killed him, yet he still understood so little about this place. But he could not afford to stand dazedly watching them. He was still too close to the two most damaged buildings, the conference center and the main tower, which seemed to be barely holding together. Bits of roof and facade came whirling down at intervals from the spotlight-painted heights to shatter against the ground, deadly as grenades. With Cumber still in tow, Theo staggered out toward the Daffodil House gardens, and at last fell to his knees to retch up what felt like pounds of soot, coughing so hard that he could only lie on the ground when he had finished, too dizzy and weak to get up. For a long time he lay gasping, watching sparks drift past as he slid in and out of a fractured near sleep, while Cumber sat beside him, mumbling to himself and moaning. At last, a female fairy appeared out of the murk, her eyes wide but her ash-smeared face wearily blank. She handed each of them what looked like an expensive goblet before she wandered off again into the near darkness and the new rain. Theo sat up and drank a little of the water, coughed most of it up, then drank again. For a brief moment his entire life was in that silvery thread of water running down his throat, a thing of indescribable sweetness and wonder. As he sat, feeling for the first time in hours that there might be some point to being alive, another shape came staggering toward them like a broken toy. That poor bastard's in worse shape than we are, was all Theo had time to think. Then the wind pushed the smoke away, and he could see a familiar face. For a moment he thought he must be wrong, fooled by the dim light. But as the figure came closer, 10 paces away, 9, 8, he grew certain. Stunned and exhausted, he could not think of the name or remember why this sudden visitation should seem so unlikely. But he did know that filmy-eyed face. He did. "Iron and blood," Cumber groaned, watching the approach. "Look at that poor bastard. He's been blinded." "It's him," Theo said, almost too quiet to hear himself. "It's Tansy's cousin." A moment later the name came back too, but so did the memory of Rufina Swift-Daisy being stabbed to death in Penumbra Station. Before Theo could speak again, Rufinus's long coat flapped open to reveal the wrinkled, black-rimmed gape where the slit belly had collapsed inward, and Theo felt an electrifying terror run through him. This was not Rufinus, but something that wore his body, and Theo knew exactly what it was. The dead thing came straight toward him. Air hissed through its gaping mouth as the hands came up, shriveled fingers flexing. Theo scrambled to his feet and tripped over Cumber Sedge. A moment later the corpse was on him, clutching at him with idiot strength. So frightened he could not shout for help, Theo smashed at the familiar but empty face that loomed over him, slamming his hand against it until he felt bones crack. But although he forced a belch of carrion air out of it, the thing did not lose its grip. The hands on his neck were icy cold. He grabbed at its body, trying desperately to push it away, and gobbets of flesh came loose in his hands like boiled chicken. The clutch on his throat grew colder, seemed to bury his thoughts in frost, turn his muscles into silt bleeding from the bank of an icy river. He could see nothing, think of nothing but the slack-skinned face. Abruptly, the fingers came off his neck, and the living corpse tumbled from on top of him. He could hear Cumber's frightened grunting as the Farisher beat at the thing's head with his water goblet. Theo rolled over, gasping for breath, but strangely dreamy and slow-minded as he watched the thing fight back in near silence. It clutched doggedly at Cumber Sedge's scorched pants leg, crawling up him even as the whimpering fairy beat its head, the head that had once been Rufina Swift-Daisy's, and which still had the look of a grisly caricature, into a shapeless knob. Shaking off the frost on his thoughts, Theo crawled across the ground and tackled the dead thing, which pulled Cumber down as well. For a moment they both thrashed in panic, tangled in each other, as well as their clawing, relentless adversary. Theo got away first and kicked the thing as hard as he could, felt ribs break underneath the mummified flesh. He kicked it again and again until it had to let go of Cumber to protect itself, curling like a silent, stinking spider. But even after the Farisher was free, Theo kept kicking it in a screaming fury of horror and disgust, kicking the torso into broken meat and fragmented bone until Cumber Sedge yanked him away. "It's dead now," the Farisher told him. "It's dead." "It was already dead," Theo gasped. He pulled free and kicked it again. The thing's eyes seemed completely dimmed now, the body finally motionless. "Hurry up," he said. "We have to get out of here." He grabbed at Cumber and began to pull him away from the body. "Wait," Cumber said. "You need help? You're bleeding." Another shape appeared out of the murk and stopped beside the huddled thing. "Here. What's going on? What have you done?" The newcomer growled at them. "Come back." "It's a constable," Cumber said, relieved. "Hold on. He'll help us." Theo had no strength to spare on such nonsense. He sped to a staggering trot, tugging Cumber Sedge after him. "That man attacked us!" Cumber shouted back at the constable. He was dragging at Theo's arm, trying to slow him down. "We didn't want to." "Shut up! Where do we go?" Theo demanded. Cumber was still staring. Theo looked back and wished he hadn't. The constable was kneeling over the body on the ground, and for a moment it appeared that he was giving the victim the kiss of life, but the thing's ragged arm was around his neck, holding him in place, and it was the constable who was twitching and struggling. "Oh, sweet Jesus," Theo murmured. Cumber ran on half-heartedly, still staring back at the bizarre scene. "But it's taking a new body." "New body?" Theo slowed down until Cumber Sedge was in front of him, then gave the Farrisher a rough push that made him stumble and almost fall. "Damn you, run! That wasn't a person, it's that corpse thing that already tried to kill me once." They had only gone 100 yards when the dark, bulky shape of the constable stood up and let Rufinus's limp body slump to the ground like a sack of rubbish. The constable swiveled his head in a very unnatural way until he located Theo and Cumber. Then, like a mechanical toy or an insect, he turned the rest of his body to face the same direction before starting after them at a heavy, awkward trot. Theo put his hand on Cumber's backbone and shoved him forward again, propelling the Farrisher back toward the smoking, spotlit hulk of the Daffodil House Conference Center and the greater safety of other people. But would the frightened constables trying to save lives at a disaster site intervene even to save him from what looked like one of their own? Would they intervene to save him from what looked like one of their own? Even in his exhaustion and confusion, Theo could see that it was much more likely they would hold him up long enough for the thing to catch him. As he suddenly veered from the glaring lights and confusion near the front door, Cumber slammed against him and they almost fell down. He looked back and saw the constable-shaped thing had narrowed the distance to only a few dozen yards. "Where do we go?" "There!" Cumber pointed to a door in what looked like a small hut or a public restroom just to the side of the looming outer wall of Daffodil House. "Are you crazy? We'll be trapped in there. Do what I say." Cumber bumped him toward the door. Theo scrabbled it open and they plunged through onto a small landing, then almost fell down the stairs when the door closed behind them, sealing them in darkness. "What the hell is this?" "Down! Hold on to the railing." They had reached the bottom of the fourth short flight when Theo heard the door groan open above them and the first sounds of booted feet on the stairs. He and Cumber spilled off the bottom landing and out into a flat space. Suddenly, a greenish light leaped out all around them. Cumber had produced one of the small glowing spheres from his pocket. They were in a vast room, low but wide, and they were entirely surrounded by parked cars. "A garage? We're going to die in a garage?" A sudden spark of hope flickered through Theo. "A car! You have a car here." "No," said Cumber, "but there's a way out of here that leads to the other side of the grounds. This way." They stumbled to the far side of the garage, but when they pulled open Cumber's escape door, it was to find the corridor full of smoking wreckage from above, the way blocked. Their pursuer had just come down off the stairs at the far side and started across the garage floor toward them, boots knocking echoes, a stone-faced, stiff-legged shadow. Theo turned to the smoldering rack, hoping that at least he could find a piece of burning wood to use as a weapon. Comic books and fairy tales and movie images flickered through his head. A torch! They're scared of fire. Monsters are scared of fire, aren't they? Then Cumber began to pull in a different direction. Over there! The main stairs! Are you crazy? We'll just get trapped inside the building and it'll fall down on our fucking heads. At least here we might be able to get past that thing, get out into the air. Theo didn't want to die in some hole like this, and he certainly didn't want to die gasping for breath inside the smoking husk of Daffodil House after he'd fought so long to get out. No! Cumber shrieked. The stairs go down! There's a stop for the train! Theo stared. The constable thing was moving swiftly, but not hurriedly. Its arms were spread wide, and for a hallucinatory moment, Theo imagined them stretching to fill the garage from wall to wall. Cumber yanked his elbow so hard he almost fell over. Hopeless, helpless, he allowed himself to be pulled back across the open floor toward the blockhouse structure at its center. The door would be locked. Theo knew it as surely as he knew his own name. He would have to play hide-and-go-seek around the structure like the smart pig locked out of his brick house, the wolf getting closer and closer until exhaustion ground him down and the hungry thing grabbed him at last. But the door was unlocked. When they had slammed it behind them, Cumber wasted a few critical seconds searching for a latch that wasn't there. They gave up and headed down. More stairs, tripping, stumbling, sometimes falling in the shaking, near-useless light of Cumber's torch. Stairs. This is hell. Hell is stairs, was all Theo could think. I'd sell my soul for a goddamn elevator. But I don't have a soul. Do I? I'm some kind of fairy. Okay, settle for an escalator then. Do you actually think there are going to be any trains? He gasped. Above them, they heard the stairwell door rasp open. Of course there aren't going to be any trains with the complex on fire, but there are tracks and tunnels and... Cumber tripped and caught himself, moaned with pain. Your leg, I forgot. Theo got under his arm. Do you want me to carry you? You can't do it. Just help me. I'll manage. 2 more flights, both of them gasping now. Then they skidded out onto a platform, slipped and got tangled and fell to their hands and knees. The dimming light of Cumber's globe showed a tunnel mouth at either end of the tiny station, dark holes that the swampy light could not pierce. Look, that thing doesn't want you, Theo whispered as he helped the Farrisher up. They could hear the steady slap of footsteps coming down the stairs, still distant, but magnified by the echo. Just me. It probably won't even notice you. Just wait until it comes after me, then go back up the stairs. Shut up, said Cumber wearily. You make a wretched hero. Let's get down onto the tracks. Which way? Away from where half a Daffodil House has probably collapsed onto them, don't you think? Cumber Sedge crawled to the edge of the platform and began trying to let himself down onto the siding, a couple of yards below. Theo, who despite his countless bruises and aches and his raw, scraped lungs was in much better shape than his companion and at least a foot taller, hurried to climb down first so he could help him. Here was another one who hardly knew him, he could not help thinking, but was risking his life on Theo's behalf. Thanks, he whispered as he lowered the Farrisher down to the tracks. Let's not die. That would be thanks enough. Gravel crunched underneath their feet as they limped toward the tunnel, the greenish light wavering on the walls, making everything seem misshapen. Back home, you have to worry about stepping on the electrified rail. Is there something like that here? Cumber snorted. Nothing so easy to avoid. And you're really sure there won't be any trains running? You'll hear 'em if I'm wrong. Theo sneaked a look back. The little station platform was still empty. The darkness began to grow thicker and thicker around them. Theo worried that the tunnel was filling with smoke, that he had breathed so much now he could not smell it or taste it anymore. He could only guess the air was thinning by the dimming of his sight. "Shit," he said finally when he understood what was happening. "Your little flashlight thing, it's dying. It's not meant to be used this long. It's for taking notes in lecture hall." Cumber narrowed it from a glowing orb to something more like a flashlight beam, but it did not seem to glow any brighter. "And when it finally goes out," Theo could not help wondering, "when it's just us in this pitch-black tunnel, with that thing behind us?" He strained for the sound of boots crunching behind them, but their own dragging feet were making too much noise. He stopped so he could hear better. "Blood and iron! Have you lost your wits?" Cumber turned and staggered back, grabbed Theo's jacket and pulled him hard. "It's either behind us or it isn't. What good is standing there listening going to do?" Theo let himself be led forward again. The light from Cumber's little globe had grown so faint that it took him a moment to notice that the roof of the tunnel was gone, and that they were in the open again, or at least as open as anything could be this far underground. It was too dark to see much of anything, but he had the impression of vast spaces and thought he could smell something more primal than the tunnel smells. A yeasty funk primarily made up of mud and growing things and water? "It's a canal, a bit of East," Cumber confirmed. "Or rather, it's some tributaries that flow into East. It's all practically a sewer down here now. And I think I see little lights out there, too." Theo squinted into the middle distance. The pinpoints of glow mounted up on either side of the track, as though he and the Farisher were walking into some amphitheater built expressly for fireflies. "It's Deeping Hollow, the kobold city," said Cumber. "Well, not just kobolds. All kinds of folk who've lost their places in the city up top. Goblins, Tommyknockers, undocumented bogles. Would they help us?" "Are you joking? The only reason we haven't been robbed and murdered so far is probably because they're all terrified by what's been happening above ground, so they're lying low." "Then where are we going?" Theo suddenly did not like the look of the clusters of small lights, and he liked even less the series of distant whistling cries that began a few moments later along the upper reaches of the invisible valley, like coyotes howling to each other from the tops of desert buttes. "I don't know. But wherever it is, it has to be better than you standing around and waiting for that dead thing to get you, doesn't it?" Theo could only grunt. It had already been the murderous mother of all bad days to begin with, and now he had to drag his bone-weary body through the depths. He was tired of pain, tired of endlessly walking, tired of being pursued. He was tired of darkness. "I guess the only thing I'm not tired of is living," he thought, "which is why I'm doing all this other bullshit." The cries from the sparkling darkness in the upper reaches of the kobold city were getting louder and more insistent. Theo bent to pick up a few good throwing stones from the bed of the railroad track, and the blood that rushed to his head almost tumbled him over. Then, abruptly, the whistling noises changed pitch, became more frantic, more confused. A moment later, the invisible observers all fell quiet. A blanket of silence that started behind Theo and Cumber Sedge and rolled over them. Theo looked around in surprise as the countless tiny lights began to wink out. "I think they just spotted our friend," whispered Cumber. "And they don't like him any more than we do." Theo supposed he was grateful that at least the ambush seemed to be on hold. He squinted back down the tracks, trying to figure out where the sudden darkening of the lights had begun. "It couldn't be more than a quarter of a mile back, maybe less," he whispered. "That thing's slow, but it never stops. I don't think it even gets tired. Good God, it must have walked halfway across Fairyland with its guts falling out just to get to Daffodil House. He turned back to the track ahead of them and looked up, startled. By the fading light of Cumber's globe, he saw what seemed vertical towers looming up only a short distance ahead of them. "What the hell is that?" he hissed. "Railroad bridge." Theo didn't like walking on trestle bridges. He had almost been caught on one by a train while larking around stoned in the Marin Hills with Johnny and a couple of the guys from one of their earlier bands. And although he had laughed about it in later years, he had never shaken off the memory of the few moments when he had not been certain he would get off in time, when he had been forced to think about jumping down 40 or 50 feet into a rocky gorge. Now another such bridge loomed right above them, the trestles no more than a ghostly filigree stretching away over an expanse of dark water that the failing light could not even touch, so black it might have been starless space. "Do we have to go over it?" "Unless you want to turn back and try to out-wrestle the thing that's following us, yes, I'd say we have to." Cumber's voice was brittle with pain, but Theo was not going to be so easily silenced. "How long is it?" "How long? I've only ever been over it on the train. Not that long, a few hundred steps, I should think." "Good." Theo clambered out from between the tracks and started down the embankment at the side. "Then we can swim across instead." He cocked his head to listen. The waters below were almost silent. There couldn't be much current. "You are mad. You really are." Cumber staggered after him, clutched at his arm. "Look at this, Theo, look." Theo couldn't understand what he was talking about. "Look at what? The bridge? I damn well see it." "No! Look what's on your wrist, fool!" Cumber pushed up the sleeve of Theo's jacket, exposing the bracelet of grass. "That's a nymph binding! Have you forgotten?" Theo was nervous at how loud Cumber was getting. "Sort of. Yeah. So what?" "So what? You belong to the nymphs. The next time you get into any body of water bigger than a bathtub, you're theirs. No arguing. You won't be able to bargain your way out of it either, unless you've been picking up some pretty fancy talismans on our little trip today and I just missed it." "Well, what are you saying? That I owe them my life or something? I didn't agree to anything like that." "No, but Applecore did to save you. A nymph binding's an old loophole. It gives you a chance to go find treasure in exchange for your servitude." He shook his head. "You may have fairy blood, Theo Vilmos, but you don't know anything. You really don't. Fairy works on bargains and agreements. Our science is all about agreements, not like that silly randomness they believe in your world. You ask, you get, you pay for it. So if I just dove in there, then whoever lived there would get to claim you. And I promise you it wouldn't be a pretty little river nymph like the ones Applecore saved you from. Oh, no. It will be something that lives deep in that black water and drinks and eats whatever the city spits out." Now Theo was beginning to panic, and not just from the unpleasant picture Cumber was painting. They had been standing and talking far too long. "All right," he whispered. "You win. We can't swim. We'll have to cross the bridge, but let's hurry. That thing is going to catch up with us any moment." They scrambled back up to the main tracks and onto the trestle bridge, forcing their endlessly aching muscles into yet another effort, stumbling every few steps. Theo did his best not to think of the distance down to the water that lapped at the pilings and what might swim beneath its opaque surface. They had only gone a few dozen yards when the tracks beneath their feet began to vibrate, a soft but distinct bumping that slowly grew louder. "Footsteps!" Theo gasped. They looked back, but there was no sign of their pursuer. Cumber then swung the light around. Nothing was visible ahead of them either. Theo turned and took a few steps back, peering into the distance. The little globe still gave off enough light that he felt he should be able to see anything that made so much racket. "Theo!" Cumber sounded very strange. Theo whirled to see a nightmare shape climbing up over the side of the bridge in front of them, surprisingly nimble for its huge bulk. It was vaguely humanoid, with pale, warty skin that glowed like the underside of a luminous mushroom. It looked only a little taller than a man, but about 5 times heavier. As it slouched confidently toward them, it almost seemed to fill the bridge. It blinked a few times. Its eyes were small and black as raisins, but did not seem otherwise put off by their light. The creature's rubbery mouth looked big enough to swallow Theo up to the shoulders. It stopped in front of them, but its body continued moving for a long moment afterward, like gelatin. It was hard to tell if the bulbous creature was sagging with fat, or whether its skin merely bunched and accordioned like the folds of a rhinoceros's hide. The only thing certain was that it was monstrously big and incredibly ugly, and that it stank like a tidal flat. "Yum," it said in a deep, bubbling voice. "Strangers on my bridge. What have you brought me?" "I've crossed this bridge on the train 100 times and never had to give you anything." Cumber's righteous indignation was undercut a bit by the quiver of terror in his words. "Ah, got a deal with the railroad, I have," the thing said cheerfully. "Family rights. We've had this bridge for centuries, and I get my little slice regular. But folk travelling on foot, that's a different matter. Tell you what, though," it said to Cumber, "you give me your chum's head, I'll let you have a free pass for 3 whole years." It leaned forward to examine Theo, who was rigid with fear and did not move a muscle, even as the thing's dreadful breath washed across his face. "Well, 2 years," it said. "We just need to go across this once," Cumber said. "We're being followed by something very, very bad." "Worse than me?" The thing smiled, showing jagged teeth of many different lengths. "Come now, you'll hurt an old troll's feelings." "It might be worse," said Cumber, struggling to keep his voice even. "And it doesn't bargain." "We'll see." The troll looked intrigued. "But first things first, if you're in a hurry." It scratched its chin, or the great, shapeless pouch of leathery flesh where a chin should be, with a huge cracked fingernail. "All right, then. I'm thinking." "Maybe you'd accept my rail pass?" Cumber asked hopefully. The troll laughed, a sulphurous hiss. "Rail pass? That's a good one." It brought talon to chin again. "Tell you what, I can afford to be generous, since times have been good. Not only my stipend from the railroad, but now that all these folk have moved down from above ground, there's always little ones playing on the tracks, so it's been a jubilee year for me. And if they're blowing each other apart up there, it will only get better. So I'll give you a bargain. A finger." "A finger?" Theo had thought things were already at rock bottom. "You want to have a finger from one of us before you let us cross?" He darted a look back and was half certain he could see something coming down the tracks toward them out of the dark distance. No. A finger from each of you. That's a very generous offer, you know. In the old days, I'd have just eaten one of you. At least one." Theo stared at the nightmare beast, crouched in its armor of pale folds, like some kind of giant sumo toad. He had a moment's fantasy of simply running past it, but knew without being told that it wouldn't be so easy. He also thought that the bargain might not be so agreeable after it caught him. "This is crazy. This is a bad dream." He looked back. Something was coming toward them out of the shadow, a moving bit of darkness. It was only a distant speck, but getting bigger every moment. "All right," he said out loud. He felt suddenly cold all over, sick to his stomach. No good delaying. "You can take them from me." He stuck out his left hand, tried to make a joke despite his spiking terror. "At least I'm a singer, not a guitar player." "Hey, he can take one from each of us," argued Cumber. "Now you shut up. You wouldn't even be in this if it weren't for me." A huge bumpy hand with skin like damp rubber folded around his own so that only his fingers stuck out, his hand and wrist gripped as though by an industrial vice. "Oh, you sing, do you? If you're ever back this way, you should drop in again. I love music." The immense mouth yawned open, and Theo stared in horrified fascination at the tangle of rotting teeth. How would he be able to wash himself down here, clean and bandage the wounds? What kind of horrible diseases would infect him? He couldn't look. He curled his middle finger and index finger to keep them away from that filthy maw, shut his eyes tight, and concentrated on not throwing up as he waited. He opened his eyes again. The massive face was close to his hand, but the horror movie mouth was closed, as were the eyes. The thing was sniffing, or at least its two pinhole nostrils were twitching. What is that smell?" the troll rumbled. "Like cow, but different." It took Theo a moment. "My leather jacket?" "I've never smelled anything like it." It flared its nostrils and inhaled deeply. "Cow skin, but not like any I know." "It's from the mortal world." "Oh, sorry. It's from the mortal world," said Cumber. "That skin comes off a cow from the mortal world. Very rare." "It's lovely. Makes my mouth water something fierce." The troll turned to stare at Theo over his prisoned hand. The little eyes narrowed again in a cunning squint. "Tell you what, not that your fingers aren't nice in their way, but I'd be willing to make do with only one in exchange for this piece of skin." "No fingers," said Cumber. "You get the cow skin, but that's all." For an absurd moment, Theo almost argued. His beloved jacket! He'd had it for years. And he thought about how long he'd had his fingers. "Well," the troll frowned a doughy frown, then released Theo's hand. "Right then, a bargain." Theo hastily shrugged off the jacket, but pulled out his great-uncle's notebook before he handed it over. "It's yours." "Nice," the thing said in its deep, suety voice. "I'm not even going to eat it all at once. I'm going to savor it. Thanks. Say, if you ever pick up anything like this, remember, I love to bargain." But Theo and Cumber were already hurrying across the bridge as fast as their weary legs would carry them. It was only after they had left the trestle and its guardian far behind that Theo realized he had left Tansy's telephone brooch in the pocket of his jacket. He had no plans to go back for it, of course. As far as Theo was concerned, that piece of two-legged ugliness was welcome to blow out Tansy's long-distance bill or download a ton of troll porn and charge it to the Daisy commune. Betray me, huh? Taste the revenge of Vilmos. They collapsed at last and lay gasping for a long time until they regained the energy even to sit up. "Come on," Theo said at last, climbing slowly to his feet, despite every muscle in his body shrieking at him not to do it. Cumber's globe was only a flicker of green now, no stronger than a nightlight in a child's bedroom. We can't stay here. That thing was right behind us. But it has to cross the bridge to catch us. You don't understand how bad that thing is, how hard to stop. A sudden and unwanted memory of it coming through the screened bathroom window of his cabin, like cheese through a grater, weakened his legs so much he almost fell down again. You have no idea. Perhaps, said Cumber, but you're probably underestimating how difficult it is to get past a troll guarding its own bridge. What if it takes the troll's body, like it took that constable's? Cumber considered for a moment. I don't know if that's even possible. If it is, it'll be slower, but a great deal stronger. But it would have real trouble following us above ground, I think. A troll like that probably hasn't seen full daylight for centuries. It would be like making it walk through an oven of red-hot coals. That zombie thing won't care. It probably doesn't even feel pain. It kept Rufinus's body even with all the insides falling out. Yes, but it would also be very conspicuous. People would certainly notice a cave troll stumbling around like that. Make it a lot harder for the thing to sneak up on us. He frowned as Theo helped him stand. Then they began to walk rapidly along the tracks again. Yes, I think we need to think about going back above ground once more. Where do we go? Do you have some friends that could hide me? He felt ashamed for asking. He had already brought this young fairy nothing but trouble and terrible danger. Not in the city. Not anymore. I've never lived anywhere but here. I've never lived anywhere here but Daffodil House. Let me think. We certainly do need to find someplace safe. I can't believe it. Hellebore and his cronies would stage a monstrous attack like that and then let everything else go on as normal. It must be an all-out flower war. They'll have troops rounding up their enemies, most of them who won't be even seen again. Not only am I the strangest stranger I could ever be, Theo thought as they limped along the tracks, listening always for the sound of pursuit. Now I'm a fugitive, too. Everybody's trying to kill me. And at this very moment, my favorite jacket that I've had since I was a teenager is being eaten like steak tartare. A laugh came out that was half sob, or perhaps it was the other way around. This has to be the worst fairy tale there ever goddamn was. Cumber's globe of light had shrunk to the strength of a dying, green-glowing match by the time they found a worker's ladder leading up from a switching station to the surface. Wearier than he had ever been in his life, it took Theo half an hour to climb the 100 or so rungs, pushing Cumber up ahead of him, step by cautious, exhausted step. They emerged at last out of a service hut on an empty railroad siding beneath a muted dawn sky full of dark, sooty clouds. Surrounded by trees and hedges, they could see little of the city, but at least half a dozen vast pillars of smoke still rose to the heavens around them. They've burned all their enemies' houses down, Cumber whispered. They tried too tired to speak more. They climbed down off the railroad embankment and found themselves in an industrial district, but one in which there were few signs of life. The only movement came from swirls of snowy ash picked up and dropped by the circling winds. They found a bus stop and waited with dumb hopefulness, but after a quarter of an hour it seemed obvious that no buses were coming. We have to put some room between ourselves and that thing, Theo said. We probably can't lose it completely. It's already followed me all the way from my world, and it certainly tracked me from the train station where it got Rufinus's body. But we can buy ourselves some time. Let's head for a main road, Cumber suggested. It almost seemed a cruelty beyond any of the horrors Theo had survived to have to walk again when he was so tired and sore, to have to put one foot in front of the other. The streets were so empty that he could not help wondering if Hellebore and his army of excisers hadn't done more than simply attack their enemies, if they hadn't found some way to destroy the entire populace of Faerie as well. But as they moved into what seemed more of a commercial district, they saw a few signs of other living beings. A car passing at the end of a street, faces peering out through the upper windows, and finally, a line of people waiting to get into a small corner store, stocking up on necessities, Theo imagined. Cumber abruptly hobbled out into the street, leaving Theo to gape after him. A moment later, a tiny little truck appeared out of a side street and began to head away, but Cumber caught up to it at a limping run and stood talking with the driver for long moments, then waved Theo over. "Hey, it's the end of the world," the little bearded fellow was saying as Theo approached. His skin had a distinctly azure cast, and he had ears like a kangaroo rat. "Stone's honor! I'm heading out toward Birch, where my people are. You'd be wise to get out too." The truck was of an appropriate size for its gnomish owner. Since Theo and Cumber could not fit in the tiny cab, they stretched out on the bed of the truck, making themselves as comfortable as possible in the middle of a collection of weird tools and artifacts that seemed as though they'd only be useful for sitting on top of other things to keep those things from blowing away. The little truck moved agonizingly slowly, but it was bliss not to walk, and they made fairly good time with so few other vehicles on the road. The knotted black pillars of smoke seemed to stare down at Theo like monstrous cobra gods, but even that could not keep him from sliding in and out of sleep as the little vehicle jounced its way across town. He woke up, his head aching horribly, to find that the truck had stopped and Cumber was trying to get him to climb out of the back. The driver did not wait for thanks. As soon as they were both on the sidewalk, he put it in gear and puttered away. It seemed to be a public park. Theo did not care. He let Cumber lead him down a dirt path and then off the trail and into a grove of trees. They clambered into a tangle of ivy that blanketed a hillside and stopped. Within moments, Theo had dropped into sleep like a stone falling down a well. And even though it's still not quite the end of the hour, yeah, there's not really any good place to stop for a while after that, so we will stop there at the end of the chapter. And we will get to chapter 27, Buttons Bridge, tomorrow, for those of you who will be about or will be watching it in recorded form. We will get on with it tomorrow and read the next bit. So there we go. And hello to everybody else who's showed up, since I had a chance to say hello to everybody. Todd and Anna and Andreas, and see you later, Josh. There goes my nephew. My very, very, very fine nephew. So anyway, my English nephew. I have several English nephews, and I have several American nephews. I am nephew rich, but they are all individuals, and very fine individuals at that, so I am not complaining. Having a glut of good nephews is, one of life's little pleasures, and I got plenty. Okay, so what else? Anything else that I wanted to talk about tonight? I can't really think of anything other than, as usual, I'm enjoying reading the book. I've always been quite fond of this book, even though it's been quite a while now. I mean, that's the shocking thing about having been doing what you're doing for a while and creeping along through life, just kind of living it, is you look up one day and realize something that to you happened in the middle of your career actually happened 20 years ago. But like I said, I'm still rather fond of the book. And all I can say is it's fun to read. I do apologize for the probably wandering accents, especially with Cumber, who I've been trying different things with as I went along, because I'd never If I had the time and the sense to do these things properly, I would go through them ahead of time. I would lay out the cast of characters so that I could figure out, make a note and what kind of a voice or something that I was going to do with all of them. But folks, it ain't like that. Too confused, too overwhelmed, too busy, too me, which is not an excuse, just an explanation. And as a result, I kind of wind up just sort of like picking it up each time and going, God, I hope there's not anybody that I've completely forgotten showing up, and I'm going to have to completely improvise a voice on the spot. But on the other hand, that adds some fun to the whole thing too. That's kind of a bit of a seat of your pants, tight-ropey thing where you have no idea what you're going to do until you get there, and then you just do it. And then if you're me, you turn off the camera and you vanish. Oh, you disappear and you don't have to take the blame for anything, which is good. It's all good. Anyway, so now it is now 3 o'clock in the morning my time. I am going to, God knows what, eat some ice cream, go to bed. I wish you all the very best. I thank you, as always, for joining me. I thank you for all your kind words and your support of many others in many other kinds of ways as well. And I hope that you're enjoying this and that it's helping you to pass the time during a tough time for most of us. Be good to yourself, be good to your friends and family, your loved ones, your neighbors, a lot of people in need right now in a lot of different ways. So help take care of other people. There's a lot of humans out there, and a lot of them need help. Until tomorrow, my time, or later today, my time, 7 p.m., I will see you all, and I thank you very much for joining me, and yeah, that's it. I'm outie. Good night.